Yeah, so Mississippi, the significance of it in the Mississippi Valley, like we said, the cotton was very, very huge. And at one point, I think the economic significance of slaves and the economic value of slaves, if you can ever put a monetary value in human beings. But somebody said at that period of time that it was much, much larger than the combined value of all the banks and railways and manufactured goods combined. So yeah.
And just to add to that point, I think it's also to build the context. You get the feeling in the Caribbean, there was more focus on the plantations which were feeding the mother countries.
Yes.
And not to say that North America was not, but there was a lot more emphasis of this being a settlement.
Yeah.
And the industrialization process needing to take from the east moving on to the west, south. So that evolution and development of the American economy was that there was much more focus there, vis-a-vis what was happening, I think, in the Caribbean, where there was a lot more of plantations that would then, so you're not building any railways necessarily, unless it is to ship this product back to Europe. Yeah. But in America, there was this idea that Europe has actually taken over this place, we are here to stay, and the industrialization that's happening in Europe in tandem also needs to happen in America.
Yeah, so like the exploitation of the raw materials was much more stark in terms of South America.
Yeah.
And also, we have to also mention like the Indian slaves who were transported over from the East Indies, who became the West Indians. So it wasn't just blacks that were used, but you also had those Indians who eventually now became the ruling populations in many countries, like in Guyana and Trinidad. But
and
there were Indian slaves as well.
Exactly, not to mention that also in Africa there was that kind of thing.
Yes.
If you look at Madagascar, there were actually quite a lot of Indian slaves that were brought onto the Madagascar island as well.
Yeah, so for our viewers, we will have an episode specifically on the Indians and the roles that the Indians played in building a lot of our nations in Africa, but also in the West Indies, in places like Trinidad and Guyana especially, and some of the Indians went over to Jamaica. And for my Rasta brothers, just a quick note, it's actually the Indians who introduced the Sensimilia seed or the ganja seed over to Jamaica.
Ooh.
And there's a lot of...
I don't know, I think that sounds like a good thing.
And there's a lot of crossbreeding between Indian cultures, especially the Hindu culture, and gods like Shiva and the Rastafarians. So we will have an episode on the impact of slavery on Indians and how Indians actually helped build a lot of these societies. But so back to North America and cotton. Labor intensive, as we have mentioned many times. And just to mention what life was like in these plantations. There was a very famous speech by Malcolm X in the mid-60s or the early 60s or the late 50s about the house Negro and the field Negro. But cotton itself, the psychology of cotton, we're talking about the psychology of racism in Africans and in black people generally. Working in cotton plantations, cotton itself is a very light material. And there was a quota that had to be reached on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and on a monthly basis. Now, dealing with this cotton in these plantations, the texture of cotton, I remember reading, I'll have to remember, maybe somebody can remind me in the comments, a book about somebody who was talking about the psychology of hair. And if you can imagine working with cotton, what does cotton feel like?
Nappy hair.
It feels like nappy hair. And so this author was arguing about, again, maybe somebody can remind me who actually came up with this argument, but I thought it was a brilliant argument. Arguing that the texture of cotton and having to deal with cotton day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out, actually is part of the reason why Africans or people of African descent came to loathe the texture of their own hair. Because you're feeling this cotton, then you feel your nappy head, and then you have the invention later on of the hot comb. Where these slaves would come and be like, y'all gotta straighten out y'all hair. And so that might be part of it actually. But life in plantations was also very severe. I know we said it wasn't as brutal in terms of the numbers of people who died in comparison to South America, but it was still pretty brutal. The main difference being that whereas in South America, a majority of the slaves, and most slaves over there actually were kept in family units because of the influence, especially in those Spanish colonies of the Catholic Church. and the patronage, or the quote-unquote patronage that they would like us to believe that was there, they were kept in those family units. In North America, no such thing.
Yeah.
Family units were often broken up because the daughter of one slave or the son of this slave or this man would be sold to a different area,
yes.
Separating him from his wife and his children. You had this practice of backbreaking, which we would get to, it's a family show, so we're not going to get too deeply into those details.
But if you want to know more, you can always look it up.
But you can always look it up and see what backbreaking means, and how those kind of abuses, sexual and physical, actually led to the mental breakdown of our brothers and sisters in North America.
Psychological breakdown.
Yes, and you can actually, a lot of that is now being manifest in terms of how you see the societal structures and the fractures that are now happening. A lot of people don't actually equate those kind of things to the
current manifestations
that were being perpetuated against them in the 1800s. But life in the plantation was very hard. You had these people working sometimes 20, 21 hours a day. I remember reading somewhere that one slave master saying that slaves only need 3 things: cloth, a stick, and bread.
Oh my.
Cloth to cover up their bodies, just cloth, a stick to beat them when they're not working, and just a minuscule amount of food and bread, so they can be barely able to survive and function. So the life of slaves in plantations was very hard. And I mentioned the house Negro and the field Negro. And the house Negro, those slaves who were sent to work in the master's house as domestic servants, whereas the field Negroes were the ones who are now working in
doing
the
all the
plantation.
hard labor.
And so what you get happening when you see that kind of division of labor is a lot of animosity, because you think that person is in a nice warm house, and which is actually what tended to happen in a lot of circumstances. There was a lot of hatred that was engendered because of the fact that some slaves saw that these slaves were the favorites of the masters.
And I think you had to be a favorite for you to be picked to be a house Negro.
Yes.
You were not just anybody. I'm sure you were better at executing the household duties. Yeah. You were neater in your approach and whatever it is. But you were more malleable and therefore could probably be brought a lot closer.
Yeah.
But if you were a rebel and hard, you needed to be in the fields where you could be whipped if you stepped out of line.
Exactly.
It's crazy just to think that. I think this topic has been so hard for me because these are actually people. And the realization that so much suffering, and there was nobody in the world who was coming to the aid of a lot of these people. It's actually quite heartbreaking.
It is very, very heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So yes, the house Negro and the field Negro. If anybody is curious about where that phrase came from, you can look it up. It was a very famous Malcolm X speech, and you had a lot of these draconian laws that were passed primarily by the South, which is where slavery was very prevalent. I think you had one South Carolina law that was passed in 1740 that said a master had permission to either whip or kill. I mean, the disparity between those two punishments is so huge. But to whip or kill any slaves that were either growing their own food, learned to read or write, or assembled in groups. This was a South Carolina law passed in 1740. Then you had the Virginia law that stated that any child that was born of a slave woman was still a slave, irrespective of the fact whether his father was white or not. Anybody who converted to Christianity and was black was still a slave, irrespective of Christianity, because there was that kind of contradiction. How do you reconcile Christianity to slavery? Well, they did away with that one.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And so the children born out of a slave master's relationship, a white father, let's say.
Yes.
Weren't those
like a white slave master.
Yeah, white slave master. Weren't they the ones who became the house Negroes? Is that because I read somewhere that they tended to be, the more kind of mixed race blacks?
Yes, those ones are the ones that tended to be house Negroes. And so you have this kind of grading of also the color gradient that we touched on when we talked about South Africa and Southern African psychology and racism in Southern Africa. Yeah. So you had that. So all these kind of draconian laws were being introduced to subjugate blacks. And this continued for a very, very long period of time. Like we said, the first blacks who arrived in the Americas in 1619, all the way up to the early 1860s.
Yes.
Tensions were building up. And then eventually you had this character called Abraham Lincoln. But before we come to Abraham Lincoln, actually, we should also talk about Andrew Jackson. Because I've seen it in a couple of history textbooks and some books and some YouTube videos, people defending it. I think President Trump himself defended Andrew Jackson. One of his statues was under threat.
Yeah.
But Andrew Jackson is the person who was solely responsible for the Indian Removal Act of 1830s, which is where the Native Americans, or the Native Indians, or the natives, were put into reserves and were moved off their land. And I think you had an event in 1831 called the Trail of Tears,
yes,
which is where the Choctaw Indians were moved from their land in Mississippi to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And I think a third of the population died on the way.
Yeah.
And Andrew Jackson was the person who was responsible for writing the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which would displace all these Indians from their land and take them to other places west, going to the western frontier, solely for the purpose of clearing them off so they could grow more cotton.
I think just really, it gives me this pause of reflection, the mental state you have to be in to be able to kind of, everywhere you go, just move indigenous populations out of their land, take over that land, and then exploit it for whatever reason, to the detriment of other human beings. I think for me, that is really a place of pause for me. I mean, we can try and frame it and say, oh, it's capitalism, we are building the monarchies, and I think we've started with the story very well around these monarchies were part of one big family, and they wanted to take over the world.
Exactly.
And they were all competing. It was cousins competing, who's got the fastest, biggest boat that's going to get people out there to colonize. Yes, but the mentality, the thought process, just try and put yourself in that kind of thinking where you can go somewhere and actually either kill off people, move them into places where you can control and kill them or make them slaves, bring others who are slaves, take over this land, make it productive for your benefit, and still be okay with that.
Exactly.
I think that's really, for me, just mind-blowing.
And the psychology of that is something that is very hard to come to terms with.
And I think we need to do the psychology of racism in white people, because
we definitely will.
That is something
will.
So
look out for that, guys. The psychology of racism in white people and how that came about. Because it's very important to have kind of a homogeneous view on this whole thing.
Yeah,
and it's cannot just focus on black people.
And it's back to the concept that slavery and racism were never intertwined, but somebody built a thought process that gets people to behave and work in this way.
Exactly.
The power of mind control is something that we really need to think about.
And on that topic of racism and the psychology of racism and how that was ingrained and inculcated within the psyche of people, brings me to this, the point of the American national anthem, which was written by a guy called Francis Scott Key. Yeah. And a lot of people don't actually realize this, but read the third verse of the national anthem. Most people just know the first verse. And it's very interesting how that story came about, because that was written directly after the War of 1812 between the British and the Americans, because the British, having seen this large slice of pie completely disappear from the table, was like, hey, we can't just let this thing go. We're still hungry, not even hungry, we can't call them hungry because they had all these colonies, we're still greedy.
We're still greedy.
And so they had this war that they fought against the Americans. Very few people know about the War of 1812 actually, look it up. And where the British actually went to the blacks in the southern states, and they were called colonial marines, and said, listen, if you come and fight on our sides, we will emancipate you. We will give you the freedom that these southern American overlords are refusing to grant you.
Similar to what they've done in Jamaica, where with the maroons, they were then saying, okay, well, you can be free, but we need a treaty, and you need to give us this and that.
The location was different, but the strategy was the same. Exactly right. So like the colonial maroons, Marines, those black slaves that were fighting for the British, a lot of that was the reason or the spark as to why the American national anthem was written, especially that third verse that Francis Scott Key talks about. He says something like, and no one can give refuge to the hiring of slave, from the grave or something like that. But he's basically saying that, you know, these blacks and these hirelings that are fighting for the British cannot be saved from the barrel of a gun.
Wow.
And that is the end of the third verse of the American national anthem. And so when you people are standing
when you're pleading their allegiance and singing this anthem.
Exactly. So when you see all these black Americans standing up and putting their, read your own national anthem. And so, like, as Ed was talking about the psychology of racism, by this point, when we're talking about the Portuguese and the Spanish, trying to make sure and engender this feeling of the superiority of the white race to the blacks, by this point, it had become calcified within the psyche of white people, especially in North America.
And the religion, everything.
Yeah. And the religion and everything. And so, and this, you know, was personified by the writing of the national anthem. Look at the third verse once again. It was also seen by the person who designed the Confederate flag. I think his name was William T. Thompson.
Yes.
The initial Confederate flag was all white. and it changed. And that guy, William Thompson, was like, to paraphrase the quote, was basically, this is a fight for the preservation of the superiority of the white race over these blacks who they had transported over to. So by this point, racism is well and firmly, truly entrenched within the psyche of peoples in the Americas. And cotton is a massive thing. The economic power in the original 13 states of the American, this new fledgling nation called the United States of America, the economic power lay in the South. And what drove the economic power was slavery and cotton. And so
Europe and America and South America were built off the backs of black slaves.
Exactly. And the economic power that you now see, that is called the United States of America, is only an economic power because of slavery.
Blacks.
And because of blacks. And because of Africans. To put it bluntly. So, and the reason I say that is because the profits that came from cotton, like I said, I think by 1840, 59% of export profit came from cotton. This is from 1840. So by 1860, at the start of the American Civil War, it was even higher.
Yes.
And so, the southern states that wanted to secede were like, why do we have to be with the North? These guys want to abolish slavery. We are the economic power. Why don't we secede? And another thing that really gets my goat is this kind of eulogizing and mythologizing of somebody called Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
Because Lincoln is quoted many times throughout his presidency as saying, if I could preserve the Union but keep slavery, I'd do it in a heartbeat.
Yes.
And the other thing that people don't realize is that what Lincoln really wanted to do, especially in his election drives in 1860, was to stop the spread of slavery to the Western territories, but to preserve it wherever it remained in the South, especially because he knew of the economic significance, and as well as that, he knew that the political upheaval that would come with trying to abolish slavery, it was not something that was feasible or that was economically viable.
Yes.
And Lincoln himself, his views on race have been widely documented, just that they have not been widely publicized. That is the difference. Lincoln himself was a white supremacist. He knew, or he believed, rather, that he believed in the segregation of the two races. He said, these guys and us guys cannot live together. So eventually down the line, these were his words that I paraphrase. Eventually down the line, either they're going to have to be taken back to Africa, or segregation is going to have to be a real thing. So he had this kind of premonition before his quote-unquote untimely death, that segregation, these guys are thinking, what's karma?
It is karma.
In the shape of John Wilkes Booth.
Oh dear.
Sorry, maybe that was a bit morbid. But, so even Lincoln himself thought the white race to be a superior race to the blacks. He believed in the segregation of the races. He did not believe that they could coexist. And so his whole election strategy was, we're going to make sure this slavery thing does not spread out to the Western territories, because keep in mind, by this stage they had acquired Louisiana because of the Louisiana Purchase, which was actually a direct result of the Haitian Revolution.
Yes.
Because when the French were defeated by those slaves in Haiti, Napoleon didn't have a need for Louisiana anymore.
Yes.
So the Louisiana Purchase happened. They sold it for, I don't know how many dollars per acre, but it became a significant amount of money. So Louisiana was actually bought as a direct result of the Haitian Revolution. So anyway,
interesting.
Lincoln did not believe in the mixing of races, and the Civil War happens because the southern states want to secede.
Yep.
To cut a long story short, they eventually lose. And so what you find out happening is, after 1865, actually you had something that was called the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln freed the slaves. And part of that, which a lot of people do not know, is that Lincoln offered the slave holders restitution or recompense of $1 million for lost property being those slaves that had now been freed.
And I think back to slaves were chattels, they were
yes.
property. So really, yes. So legally, he was in his place to actually compensate them for loss of property.
Exactly. In strict legal terms.
Yeah.
Take away the
human aspect. In strict legal terms, he was within.
Right. And that was the mindset of the time anyway.
Wow.
So the slaves are nominally freed in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation. You went through a period of about 12 years in the States of what they call Reconstruction, where there was actually relative freedom. So these slaves that had been freed, that had been indentured and under servitude for all those years, had relative freedoms. You had black people being elected to Congress. Blacks were able to own property and to actually vote. And to safeguard these kind of civil rights that had been introduced by the Republican Party, which many people would not be aware of. You see, a lot of times we always equate to the Democrats. The Democrats were the ones who were the slaveholders people. You don't realize that.
Yeah.
There was not one single Republican senator, I believe, by the time the Civil War started, that was a slaveholder.
Yes.
It was the Republicans who safeguarded the civil liberties that had been won with the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865, exactly. Which freed the slaves. And so this period that they called Reconstruction saw a lot of growth for blacks.
Yeah.
And how this was safeguarded was that the subsequent Republican governments had a military force, had a federal army in the occupying the southern states, to make sure that these rights were safeguarded and kept. The right to vote, the right to own land. I think, the famous 40 acres and a mule once the slaves were freed, although that was never carried out to its fullest extent.
Yeah.
And so at the end of this period in 1877, how this came about actually, for this 12-year period, how it came to an end was, you had a contested election in 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the Republican candidate, and I forget who the Democrat was. It's probably not even worth remembering, to be honest.
I don't think the Democrats are going to be very happy with that statement.
Well, sorry, but it's just historical
but
fact.
they can tell us. They can tell us in the comments.
I am non-partisan. I am just telling you. I'm telling you what happened. So yeah, Reconstruction came to an end in 1877 with something that was called the Compromise. And this was basically because of disputed elections. How many times have we seen that in American history? Yeah. Disputed elections. 2000.
It's a narrative too.
Bush, and what was it in 2000? Bush and Gore.
Yeah, Bush and Gore.
Yeah. So it was the Democratic candidate actually had the popular vote, which is one of these anomalies with the American voting system, that somebody can win the popular vote but lose the election.
Yes.
So anyway, the compromise came about in 1877 because of the contested elections. To cut a long story short, the Democrats then said, okay, we are not going to contest the results, and we are not going to contest the fact that Rutherford B. Hayes won this election.
Yes.
But what we want you to do is get rid of this period of Reconstruction. Take your federal armies away from our southern states so that we can enforce our own laws, bringing about the whole period of Jim Crow. So those relative freedoms that blacks enjoyed in the South were gotten rid of. The amount of lynchings proliferated and went up through the roof. And really slavery continued in America for a very long time. It just took different forms.
Yes.
So when people say that the slaves were emancipated in 1865,
it's a psychological operation.
Yeah, because when slavery ended,
the
13th Amendment, you had a period of indentured servitude.
Yeah.
So what happened was these southern states, knowing that their economic, vibrancy and the economic lifeblood was slavery, had to find other means to make sure that blacks remained enslaved. So even though the 13th Amendment freed the blacks, the one caveat that it had was except for those who have been imprisoned for committing crimes.
Wow.
So what happened was, especially in the southern states, any small thing could be perceived by the authorities as a crime,
Yeah, crime.
especially when it was committed by blacks.
Yeah.
So whether it was vagrancy or
Anything.
anything, if you put those blacks into the prison system, they're still slaves.
They're still slaves, because then they get to make cheap furniture.
Exactly.
For export or whatever.
Yes,
for
and
nothing.
so you had this, what they call a period of, the introduction of something that was called convict leasing. So for slavery, substitute that with something called convict leasing.
Which is an old form of slavery anyway. And as we said, even in Africa, there were those who, because they were criminals, then therefore they were slaves.
Yeah.
So again, a backdoor to the whole process of emancipating slaves. It's a backdoor way of returning the slave concept. And I'm just very interested in the fact that it's blacks who built America. But every time you hear about the popular culture of America, we have a hard-working culture. As Americans, we have a hard-working culture, hard-working, law-abiding Americans. There's something that's kind of psychologically in the popular culture always given to us. And then, until you look at the American society, even today, these hard-working Americans are still relying on Spanish labor, South American labor, not Spanish, but South American labor, migrant labor coming in to do all the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
So maybe the conclusion is white people have never worked a day in their lives.
Maybe. We will talk about that when we're talking about the
psychology of racism
in white people. And also, we talk about this this system of convict leasing.
Yeah.
That's pretty much still going on to this day.
Today. And it's deep. I think that's
deep,
actually a very deep.
The prison system in America is something, it's a topic unto itself.
Yeah.
So that is also something that we will talk about further down the line in this series. So, in a nutshell, we've seen the systems of slavery in North America, South America, and in the Caribbean.
And it's interesting that we have maroons in South Africa. We have maroons in Jamaica. But we don't really hear very powerful stories of maroons in America.
Yeah, the runaway slaves, and they were there.
And they were there. So it's I think a very neglected part of a very neglected part of bringing out the bravery of those slaves who broke free and stayed free.
Yeah.
But I think also the way in which the slave was broken in North America is something that was very different.
Yes.
Yeah, psychologically. I think there was a psychological warfare that went on that has created and perpetuated a system of thinking that may not have been the same in places like Jamaica and Haiti. And
in South America. I think that's a brilliant point, because the systematic breakdown of the psychology of people in North America was much different to South America.
Yeah.
And that you can see that taking shape in the form of how families and societies have been decimated in the black community.
In the black community.
In black America.
And as an admission, I think one of the things as Africans, when we look at African Americans, we say, well, they're lazy, they won't get the jobs, they won't do what we are willing to do as African migrant labor.
Without taking into consideration the psychological scars that they have to deal with.
They're not going to feed this system one more day. They're fed it with everything they had through their ancestors. Yeah. And so I think that's also a very important point in terms of the psychology of now arising from this slavery.
And that's a brilliant point, because I think that in medical terms, I think they call that a sequela. So like when you have a disease, and the disease is cured, but then it not totally cured, but it causes another disease.
It causes another disease.
So slavery and the black condition, especially in North America, can be described as a sequela.
Yeah.
Whereas if you see it like, for example, in a place like Brazil, you didn't have so much of that individualized kind of deconstruction psychologically as you had in North America in terms of the breakup of families when slaves are being sold, backbreaking, and all these kind of, heinous atrocities and crimes that were perpetuated in North America. Not to say that, whereas before we have already stated that slavery in South America was far harsher in terms of the numbers.
Yes.
But like for instance, in Brazil, you know, they had the whitening, like the brachymental. So the differences between South America and North America are very stark, because like I was saying before, in Brazil, whereas the kind of individualized breaking down of the mentality of black people in North America was very different. In Brazil, the slaves could still be sold in families. Yeah. So it wasn't so much individualized as in terms of a society.
Yeah.
The racism that was perpetuated there and practiced there was very different. Like in Brazil, with the whole brachymental movement of whitening the population because they thought it would be more civilized and improve their economic prospects, they still played lip service to this idea of you know, cultural inclusion. I think they called it mestiçagem, which is a Portuguese word which means mixture.
Yeah.
Mixture cultures. But all that meant was a whole deal of cultural inclusion,
yes,
but a whole lot more of social exclusion. Yeah. So like the parts of the cultures that the African slaves brought, like capoeira and samba,
they were taken,
and monetized for touristic purposes. So cultural inclusion, but a whole lot more of social exclusion. But yeah, you brought up a very interesting point about whites and whites really
never having to work a day in their lives, which is not true. By the way, it's not completely factual. You know, I think if you look at European whites, certainly there's evidence as the Industrial Revolution was coming out and in those feudal systems that white people were actually overworked, and they were the original slaves. Yeah. So they did build their countries to a certain extent and have continued to be used as a form of labor. But you can already begin to see that the economic output of these colonies that were now forging and were being grown by the black slaves were now feeding back into the center and making it a lot easier for the populations in Europe. But in America, I think there is a question mark in terms of specifically in America, you know, the use of slave labor, and then even with emancipation, continued slavery, and then migrant labor, because you've got the South Americans who are, you know, there, you've got the Jamaicans who are also coming into America, the Haitians and Africans, and a lot of people migrating into America and having actually to start on very labor-intensive type jobs, so that the white populations actually don't have to work that hard.
I think that's a valid point. I think it's a brilliantly made point. And also it brings me back to an observation that a German teacher who moved to Brazil in the 1800s said, I think her name was von Binzer, Ira von Binzer or something like that, but anyway, her observation was that in Brazil, all the work is done by the blacks.
Exactly.
The economic prosperity was brought about by the blacks. All the whites do is sit around and enjoy the fruits of their labor.
And manage.
And that is a paraphrase of her quote, but this is a German teacher who moved to Brazil making that observation. Yeah. But also to continue on from that point of America and American prosperity being built on the backs of Africans and slavery. Very true. And the proceeds of the importation of cotton actually went into other industries directly. So it really can be said that America was built on the back of 400 or you could say 246 years of free labor.
Yeah.
And it's actually much longer than 246 years when you consider the period after Reconstruction of indentured servitude and convict leasing and all these other kind of things. And another very interesting point also is how corporations actually came about.
Yes,
because corporations exploited the 14th Amendment, which was introduced after the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment was there to say, black people are people and they have the right to vote. So these very clever corporate lawyers came about and said, well, if these blacks are people, then we are also people. Because prior to that and the passing of the 14th Amendment, corporations had very clear chartered stipulations that were handed to them by the government. And they had to perform these stipulations in a benevolent way. So if you built the bridge, your remit and the charter that was handed to you was to build that bridge and nothing more. Whereas these corporate lawyers very cleverly exploited the 14th Amendment to say we are also people. And so the demon that is the modern corporation can also be traced back to the exploitation of the emancipation of slavery. So,
interesting. And so this whole thing about corporate America, you always hear that being coined as a phrase.
Yes.
And a corporate America is a place where there's a lot of competition. It's a very rough place to be. it's unfeeling, it's uncaring, it's dog eat dog, doesn't care about the family, and it's really just out of the spirit of, trying to exploit the law and exploit labor.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
So, guys, that is it. We have talked about psychology of racism in the Americas and in the Caribbean. Now, when I say we talk about the psychology of racism, we will get into this much, much deeper when we talk about Franz Fanon.
Yes, we would definitely
who is really, in many ways, the father of the psychology of racism. So we're kind of still setting the stage. And we will talk about that much more expansively. Next week, we'll get into North Africa. And our African Arab brothers and sisters. We haven't forgotten you.
Yeah.
So we will definitely go into that in depth. And then we will now look at the psychology of racism in white people and how this whole situation, are we demonizing whites unfairly? How did this situation come about? But we will talk about that in future episodes. So we have not forgotten about that, definitely.
Yes. I'm looking forward actually to that, yeah.
So, this week in history. This is our next section. What happened this week in history? So, a few things. Okay, strictly speaking, it's not actually this week. It's been a couple of weeks since we did this segment, so I'll talk about a few things.
Yeah.
October 2nd, 1967, Thurgood Marshall was sworn in as the first black Supreme Court judge.
Wow.
And he actually had a very interesting quote about separate but equal and the Jim Crow laws, which he said was just an extension of slavery.
Yeah.
Anyway. Also on October 2nd, 1800, Nat Turner was born. October 3rd, 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. October 4th, 1966, Lesotho celebrates autonomy from Britain. October 12th, 1968, Equatorial Guinea gains independence from Spain. October 14th, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the youngest man to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's amazing.
And yeah, it is. I don't know how old he was. I think he was 35.
Yeah. And
on October 15th, 1987, Thomas Sankara was assassinated by his reprobate assistant Blaise Compaoré, who stayed in power up until 2014, I think. So it was for a very long time, more than enough time to siphon the coffers of Burkina Faso. We're still suffering from that decision to this day. Our book of the week this week is The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. It's a brilliant book. I read this book about 10 or 12 years ago. One of the first books that really introduced me to the beginnings of the civil rights movement in America. It was published in 1933. And it warns about the cultural indoctrination of black people, and also preaches for autodidactism, which is that black people should not just settle for the things that they are taught in the school education system, but should learn their own histories and read up on their own histories for themselves and empower themselves. He had a very interesting quote where he says, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions, which is very, very true. So,
I mean, and that just again is the point to all these series that we are doing now about the psychology of racism.
Yeah.
Is really just to kind of touch base on how do we rewrite this history ourselves, because we have the power to do that now.
Yeah.
And to also begin to introduce fresh thinking, and that's why we also want you as the audience to kind of share information with us in terms of how we can rewrite and how we can refresh our thinking, because the way we think is actually going to dictate our future.
Yes.
And I think we really, that's an important book to have as part of essential reading.
Yeah, and to paraphrase another brilliant African-American historian, John Henrik Clarke, who said that the history of Africans had to be fictionalized and bastardized in order to justify slavery. So that's the show for this week. We really appreciate you guys joining us. Next week we will talk about the psychology of racism in North Africa and our African brothers and sisters. Remember, you can find us on all social media platforms, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Pinterest, on Facebook. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, don't forget we have our Know Your Afro Purpose course. Links will be in the description. Thanks so much for joining us, Edge.
Bye from me. See you next week.
See you next week. Asante sana. Thank you.